Good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Bruner, and I am the Purdue Extension Educator in Agriculture and Natural Resources for Clay and Owen counties. Today, I wanted to go over our Deep Dive Roses program, which was originally given live on February 25th. Today, I want to cover a little bit on how to begin to choose your roses and also how to get them prepared for pruning, for spring activities, and to kind of help wake them up from their winter nap. First of all, there are some steps to getting started with roses that we have to consider. When I get questions from my clients, they often follow very similar veins. Usually, they ask a series of questions that have statements very similar to the three in front of you right now. My roses never put out leaves. While the canes may be green and they seem healthy, nothing really happens. The roses grow and they put out leaves, but they never seem to really bloom. Or the worst one, my canes are blackened or the leaves are really spotty and the plant just doesn't seem to survive after either coming out of winter or maybe some really bad environmental disturbances like raining or flooding. A lot of this can be handled with a few easy steps, namely choosing your site and planting. We're going to go over those in just a second. So let's get started with our site selection. This is going to provide you the best possible start to make your roses begin to really take off. Choosing the best spot is going to give you the best opportunities. Some things to consider when you're doing site selection. Roses are sun-loving plants. They require at least 6 hours of direct sun, and this is going to vary by variety at least a little bit. Some roses may need as much as 8 hours of sun, whereas some can do with as little as 6 or some even as little as 5. I would treat the 6-hour limit there as what is going to probably be the most common. Air circulation for your roses is going to be very, very important because that is going to provide the best defense against disease. Fungal diseases and bacterial diseases really like to have crowded space where there's very little air movement and it's very easy to splash water. So when you choose your sites for where you're going to be planting, you want to make sure there's good spacing there so that way breezes can go through the leaves and go around the plants and help blow away spores and reduce the chance of water splashing between plants. Now, roses, unfortunately, are not the best competitors. They don't do well when there are lots of things planted near them that are using the same resources that they are. So when you're considering where you put your roses, yeah, they may look really nice in a garden that you're thinking about, but they may not survive very well. So you're going to want to give them space and give them their own resources, so that way they can really develop without stress from other plants. Now I want to play a little game with you for a moment here. I just went over some factors that are important in site selection, and I want you to look at these 4 pictures I have up right now. Now, when I originally gave this, I asked my audience to please choose a number where they thought the best rose planting site would be located. But I'm just going to kind of walk you through this one really fast. So in our first image, number 1, that is our community garden that's planted in front of the Purdue Extension office in Spencer, Indiana. This is an extremely prolific garden. It's produced a lot of fruit and vegetables in the short time that we've had it up. We started this during the pandemic. But you'll notice that there are a lot of plants that are very close together. You can also see that these plants are abutting a wall, and this wall is west-facing. Now the trouble with this is that means that it's cutting off the amount of sunlight that a plant can get down to what it's only going to get in the later part of the afternoon. And since all these plants are so crowded closely, that means that there is a lot of competition for resources. The vegetables and fruits that are being grown here are able to handle this, and we babied them a lot to make sure that they had everything. But if we tried for roses, they probably wouldn't survive very well. If we go to image 2, you could see that there's plenty of space around this area. What you're seeing here is a demonstration of how to prune done by Rosie Lerner. And the plant has plenty of sunlight. There's space around it that you can see. So this might be an optimal location to plant. Image 3 is one of the horticultural gardens on campus at Purdue University. And if you look closely at the image, you can see that a lot of these plants, they aren't roses. There are lots of flowers here, but there aren't really any noticeable roses growing. Again, competition would probably make it very difficult to grow them there. And then in image number 4, this image comes from a wolf preservation park. And you can see that there are lots of very healthy trees, a healthy forest understory, but the sunlight is being cut off by tree canopy, and it's only existing in certain areas. And, of course, there's competition. All that understory and all those trees are very jealous of their resources, and they would choke out roses very quickly. That leaves us with image number 2 being your best option. Make sure there's space, make sure there's plenty of sun. Our next step when getting our best start in roses is to choose the variety that's going to work for you. According to the American Rose Society, there are about 48 different classifications of roses, and I could probably do about 20 programs to try to cover all of them. Today I'm going to limit it down to just a couple of them, what are going to be considered the most popular roses you can find. Now, when you're planting roses, you're generally planting them for one of two purposes. Either you're wanting to do some kind of landscape improvement where you just like the aesthetic quality of roses. Or you're growing them for exhibition, where you're wanting cut roses that you could take to maybe an open class show, or bring in the house, or even sell them. And sometimes both of these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Sometimes with some like hybrid tea roses, you may be planting them for both purposes. What I strongly recommend is if you've never planted roses before and you're wanting to get into it, choose your varieties based on your experience level and the amount of time you can put into it. Don't choose a really hard Floribunda rose when you've only just gotten started. Go with something more simple like a hybrid tea that is really, really popular, or maybe a knockout rose that are really, really durable. Now, those 48 categories are broken down into 8 overarching categories. And you can see the list here that I have of them, from hybrid tea to hybrid rugosa. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm limiting down to simply hybrid tea roses and shrub roses. These encompass the most popular varieties and the ones that you're probably going to be mail ordering in, or maybe buying at a local herb show. Sometimes you may even be getting them from a garden store. These are probably the only 2 types you'll really find there. The rest of them you're probably special ordering, or you're developing out of an heirloom that you've had forever. So let's start with our hybrid tea roses. Hybrid tea roses are by far the most popular variety of rose grown today. It's impossible to not find them all over the state of Indiana. When I bought my property in the house that I live in now, there's already one hybrid tea growing out in front of my house that is an abnormally durable plant for a hybrid tea rose. And there are selections of knockouts on my property as well, and I'm going to talk about knockouts in just a moment. The American Rose Society maintains a really extensive list of the different cultivars of hybrid tea roses, and I really recommend you give that a look if you're interested in what's available and what you might be interested in growing. Hybrid teas are known for having really nice long canes that are strong. They get large blooms that have a good fragrance to them. So hybrid teas really make an ideal exhibition rose, but they're still able to grow and survive on people's properties as something you might do for landscape improvement. For example, the hybrid tea I have in front of my house, we've barely paid attention to. And it is still developing. It's putting out beautiful roses every year. So it clearly works in the environment that my home is in southwestern Indiana. Our next rose variety that I'm going to talk about are our knockout roses. These roses I actually like a little more than hybrid tea roses because they have some good qualities to them that make them very easy to grow. If you have a somewhat yellow thumb like me where you can grow things but you're not necessarily good at it, knockout roses are great for this purpose. One of the main reasons behind this is that they're very resistant to fungal disease. They were specifically bred for resistance to fungal disease. And they're also very easy to manage. They produce clusters of flowers in large numbers on bushy plants that usually don't go much beyond 4 feet by 4 feet in dimension. Pruning of these guys is very, very easy. You don't need to prune them much at all. And later on down the line during the seminar, I'm going to go over a little bit more on how to safely prune them. So why don't we dive into our planting of roses and the different methods and the different types of plantings you can do. The one that I'm going to start out with here is what's referred to as bare root roses. These are roses that you might buy in a store and the roots are covered in a bag with a little bit of soil and water in them, Or you might mail order them and get the same thing. You just get some canes, the roots are already growing, they're in a little bit of soil, and they're in a plastic bag. They're not potted, they're just kind of free floating in that bag. So what we want to do when we're getting ready to plant our bare root roses is we want to get these as close to planting as possible. And the good thing is that you can get started planting as soon as the soil can be worked and you're reasonably certain there isn't going to be a harsh snap freeze. Now here in Indiana, that can be a really difficult choice. Right now, at the time I'm recording this, the high temperature today should be about 45 degrees. The temperature yesterday was about 60, but it's early March. And if you lived in this state for any amount of time, you know that mid to late March we can get a sudden cold snap and a whole bunch of snow. And of course last year we experienced a really hard cold snap in very early May. So this can be a little bit difficult to maintain here. When you get your roses, if you're not able to plant them yet, you want to make sure you maintain the moisture that's inside the package they're in for their roots. You want to keep those root systems active. And you want to put the roses in a place where they're not going to get much sun at all. Doing this will mean that the rose will stay mostly dormant, and it's not going to start putting out leaves anytime soon. If they get exposed to sun for any length of time, you're running the risk that that's going to trigger their cycle. They're going to see that photo period and the amount of time that sun is out, and they're going to go, oh hey, it's time to start growing, and then you'll have to plant them no matter what. Ideally, before you plant them, you want to soak the roots in water for about 8 to 12 hours. Now, when these plants are shipped, whether you find them in a store or they get shipped directly to your home, those shippers really aren't maintaining the roses at the highest quality they can. They're trying to get them delivered, and usually that means they're going to dry out. So you want to rehydrate those roots and get them active again. You also want to check the roots and the canes for any infections or damage. Botrytis is a very common problem with the roots of roses when they're shipped because it's providing a great environment where it's moist, the temperature might be relatively stable, so that fungal disease is going to just really take off. And if you want to learn more about botrytis and other diseases of roses, check out my Wild About Roses program. It's also on this same YouTube channel. I would strongly consider the use of fungicide as you begin to take these roses out of their packaging to try to prevent any infections from occurring before you get them in the ground. Alright, so you've got your roses. Hopefully you're treating them the best you can to give them the best chance before you put them in the ground. Now let's talk a little bit about how to get them there. You want to work with about 3 to 5 canes per plant. If you're doing more than that, the plant may not be able to provide enough energy to itself to maintain all the canes, and you'll just end up losing canes. So try to prune back down to 3 to 5 of those canes, and then prune them back also to 3 to 5 buds per cane. That way, the rose is only using so much energy for what it currently has. It's not going to try to take too little energy and spread it across itself and just result in you losing canes. Any cane that's thinner than a pencil probably should be removed. That cane isn't as healthy, it's going to need more energy, and it's just going to take away from the canes that are already in a good spot. Now, if your rose, when you got it, had already start putting out soft shoots, you're going to want to remove those because most likely the plant stress and other things that are going to happen due to planting are going to kill those shoots, and you don't want them to be a place where disease or other issues can start. So if you have soft shoots, just go ahead and remove them. Now, when you are planting your rose, there's a certain process you may want to consider following to try to give yourself the best start. Now, you want to create a kind of planting hole that's a little more than 2 feet, maybe 2.5 feet into the ground. You're going to place the rose and the roots into this hole, and you're going to cover the roots with a kind of cone of soil and soak it in water. As it dries, you're going to add a little more soil and soak it as well, and then just keep repeating that process until the soil is level with the surrounding soil. You're going to want to make sure that you don't tamp down this soil. Don't make the soil compact, because if you do that, the rose roots won't be able to survive. You want this soil nice and loose and loamy, almost as though you could pull the root right out with your hand if you needed to. This is going to make sure that the roots can spread easily and get access to nutrients, and the plant will be able to grow without fighting against the weight of the soil itself. Also, you're going to want to make sure that when you put your rose in the ground, the bud union, the location where all the canes are starting from, is about 2 to 4 inches underneath the soil level to protect it from the environment. That way, that growing tip right there stays warm, and it's going to be able to keep putting out those new canes without freezing or having other environmental effects hit them. After ground level, as your canes come out, you're going to want to make sure you keep the bottom portions of the canes, and you can see on this image, it's labeled for about 7 to 11 inches up, mulched while it's still relatively cool. This is going to help those canes develop and grow, and then you can see from this image that the tips of the canes are poking out of the mulch. As it gets warmer, you can take the mulch away, but keep in mind what I was saying about temperatures in Indiana. Other states may experience a similar thing. Keep that mulch or a covering you may be using nearby, so that way if you hear a freeze warning for the next morning, you can cover them up really quickly and make sure the rose doesn't get too damaged. Another process that you should consider doing with your roses is the process of sweating them. This is where you're basically covering the canes to protect them from wind and helping them hydrate. Here in Indiana, when it's springtime, we get a lot of storms. We get a lot of wind, especially right now in March. So you're going to want to protect these new, fresh roses that are trying to grow from the wind that's going to dry them out really hard and potentially cause stress and cold damage to them. One method that's recommended is to use a paper, not plastic, bag and just cover the roses. Cut some slits into them as the roses develop. The idea is you want to slowly remove the bag as the canes really begin to take off and they start putting out leaves. Don't use a plastic bag though. The paper bag is somewhat porous. It's going to allow some moisture and some air movement. If you put on a plastic one, you're basically creating a sauna where the moisture is going to stay in there, the roses will get very hot, and that's just going to breed all kinds of disease and potentially just outright kill your canes. Use a plastic bag here. Now, when we're talking about our potted roses, when you're putting these in the ground, it's going to use a process very, very similar to what you do when you're using bare root roses. The benefit here is that you may already have a soil structure around the root ball. You're going to want to check that root ball though. Potted roses can very easily get bound. They can tangle and strangle the plant. So you're going to want to still check it for any potential damage. Once you've done that, you can just lower them into the ground the same distance, make sure that bud union is covered, and then go ahead and add in your soil. I want to also add a note here that when you're putting roses in and you're considering the watering for them, roses like moist soil, but they don't like soaked soil. So as you water them, you're going to want to make sure that the soil stays nice and moist. Put your finger down in the soil an inch or two, see if it's still wet, and as it dries out, add a little more water. But don't soak them. You can drown roses very, very easily. All right, so moving right along. I talked about a lot of fertilizer application in my Wild About Roses program, which you can also see me go over there, and I just wanted to go over it a little more here too as well, because when I realized when I was putting this program together, there were going to be questions about fertilizer, so I at least wanted to touch on it one more time. Now, roses have a fairly high nutrition requirement, but roses are also very, very easy to burn with too much nitrogen. So what I want you all to do is to get a soil test done before you plant. If you've ever watched any of my other programs, you know that I preach about soil tests all the time. It's cheap, it's easy, there are lots of places around Indiana and probably your local area that will help you get a soil test done. The good thing about roses is you can use a combination of organic and inorganic fertilizers, and there are a few recommendations to go with that. Ideally, you're looking for a higher phosphorus value if you're getting a fertilizer in a bag, and that's going to be that second number on the bag. The first number is going to represent your nitrogen. So what you want to do is you want to see a spot where it's maybe lower nitrogen value, but it's got a good higher phosphorus value. I also want you to use that soil test too, because if your soil shows that it's got a decent amount of phosphorus in it, you may not need to worry about that. You may just need to do a basic program of feeding. As you apply your fertilizer, you want to consider using about 3 pounds per 100 square feet or 1 heaping tablespoon per plant. Remember, you do not want to burn these plants. It's very, very easy to do. You're going to do your first application in the spring after the last frost. That's important. If you don't wait for the last frost, that fertilizer is just going to sit on top of your soil, and then it'll all either get washed away with spring rain or it'll soak in all at once, and it's just going to cause a mess and potentially burn the plant. You also want to make sure that you do not fertilize after July. If you keep fertilizing after July because your roses are growing so great, you're going to make it so that the plant will keep growing and not go through its process of hardening so that way it can survive the winter. So once we hit July, once fair time gets here in Indiana, you want to stop this process. Now, roses prefer a slightly acidic soil, usually between 5.5 and 6.5 on the pH scale. Now, in most of Indiana, that's probably where you're sitting. Our soil usually sits a little bit acidic. Some areas, however, if you have a lot of natural springs or there may have been previous activity like strip mining in your areas, it might be a little bit variable, which is why that soil test is so important. It's going to tell you your pH. If you need to raise your pH, ground limestone works really well for that. It also will help supply calcium to the plant. And if you need to lower the pH, which I think is probably more likely, you're going to use ground sulfur at a rate of about 8 ounces per 100 square feet. Now, as you are considering your fertilizers, one thing to keep in mind is that the best recommendation is aged manure. This is generally going to be fairly easy to get throughout most of Indiana. There are plenty of livestock operations. You may even be able to ask your neighbor for some and set up a little bit of an arrangement with them. However, you want to make sure that it is aged and not fresh. If you're using fresh manure, that means that you're increasing the nitrogen content in your fertilizer, and that can cause a burn. When you're using manure, you want to make sure you spread this to about a depth of 2 to 3 inches into the soil, and I would actually recommend that for all fertilizers that you're considering. That way, it's not just sitting on top of the soil where it could get washed away very easily during some of the storms. Put it into the ground and really work it in there so that way that organic material is there and it's starting to do its work. You can also do the same using liquid fish, bone meal, or blood meal. And these things you can find not only at farm stores, garden stores, you could even get them at your local fishing place if you really need to. Normally they'd be frozen, so like your blood meal, so you may need to unfreeze it before you add it to your soil. Alright, so the last bit that I'm going to talk about today is our pruning. Pruning is perhaps the thing I get the most questions on because it is the least understood. I'm going to preface this with there is probably a dozen different ways you can try to prune these. All of them are right, all of them may be wrong. The reason I say this is because pruning is going to depend on the type of rose you're growing. You're going to need to do research into the specific type of rose. But there are a few pointers I can give you. Some of this is going to go particularly over helping the roses recover from winter dieback. So, first tip, avoid pruning if the plant is weak or small. If you have a little rose plant and it is just the tiniest little thing, but it's still going, let it go. Make sure it's got food, make sure it's got water, and just let that thing grow until it can reach a better height and a better width. For example, that hybrid tea rose that I talk about in front of my home, it probably needs a little bit more food because it's kind of small. I am not taking shears anywhere near that thing except to just make sure there are no weeds and nothing else nearby. Deadheading is another pruning practice that's very, very common in roses. You're just removing heads back to a bud that's a 5 or 7 leaflet leaf. You may want to avoid touching the hips if those are a part of the display that you're looking for. I would also very strongly recommend don't take shears to your rose if it's after October. Once October 1 gets here, it's going to start getting colder. You're looking at potential freezes, and the plant is in its hardening process. So you don't want to put a new wound on the plant until it's fully hardened, or else it could cause a problem. So as we come out of our winter naps, this is where our roses are probably going to have experienced the largest amount of damage. Let's face it, it gets cold here, and sometimes it can get very, very cold. This winter, it wasn't too bad. I mean, we did just have a foot of snow in a lot of areas a couple weeks back, and our temperatures got very low, but it didn't last for long. We experienced hard cold snaps, but it wasn't like it was the entire winter the entire way through. But unfortunately, that means that those snaps could have caused some damage. So what we want to do is we want to prune these before new foliage emerges, which means you need to start doing this probably right about now. Keep an eye on the weather, look out for any potential cold snaps happening, but it is March 4th on my calendar, and judging by the temperature, I would definitely want to be taking a look at this myself. First step, assess the plant for any dieback damage due to cold stress. This is going to take the form of blackened or brown canes, so you're going to want to remove the blackened tissue down to the nearest healthy tissue. And I'm going to show you an image here. There we go. That shows a little bit about what this brown tissue looks like. You can tell these parts, they're never going to green up. They're never going to grow again. So you're going to take it down to the nearest healthy portions. Get rid of the brown parts, go down to the green. You can even see spots in this image where you can see bud lesions forming, where you need to remove that brown or blackened tissue down to that bud lesion, so that way the plant has a spot where it can begin to put out new branches, new blooms, etc. Rosie Lerner, who I credit in several of the images before, she did a lot of work demonstrating this. This is a great picture by her that shows exactly what I'm talking about. You can see those browning and blackened stems right there, and what you're wanting to do is just take them down to the nearest green, make nice straight cuts on it, and then your roses should be able to recover from the damage. These are reasonably hardy plants, so don't be too afraid to do this. And when you see a situation like this, you absolutely need to do it, or else you're just going to be losing canes and you have openings for disease. So I kind of went over this already. Cut down to the nearest outward facing bud, so that new growth is going to occur outwards, forming a nice little V for the plant. You don't want stuff growing up the middle. And like I said earlier, more specific pruning is going to be based on the plant type. Now I'm going to go over just a few of these plant types, so that way you have a starting point to go. But I would encourage all of you, feel free to contact me if you have additional questions. I'll make sure that my contact information is at the end of this video. Okay, so for our bush-type grafted plants, these plants you need to cut 4 to 8 canes to about a uniform height, spreading away from the center, forming that nice V shape that I was talking about earlier. You also want to make sure that you remove any canes that are coming from below the graft union. So if you have a cane coming out of there, that means it's not going to be the type of rose you want because you grafted this plant. You need to make sure that the roses are coming above that graft union, and that's whether from the trunk or the roots. So keep an eye on that bud union. Climbing roses usually flower very, very consistently, and they generally don't need much pruning. Mainly, you're just going to be looking for the dead canes or the weaker ones, and then just remove those. Also, if you've got green canes, but they've not been producing for a year or two, go ahead and get rid of those canes as well. They're done producing. They're not helping you out. They're just eating up energy that could be going towards blooming. So go ahead and get rid of those on your climbers. Ramblers and large flower climbers usually bloom only about once a year. Now you want to make sure that you prune these guys right after the blooms fade, and you want to make sure you remove the canes. That way you can make room for the new canes that are going to develop in the following year. Basically, you're going to be cycling these through. The canes grow, they bloom, you remove them, make space for the new stuff, and just repeat the following year. Our shrub roses are the ones that I've been focusing the most on during this talk. This is going to be our knockout roses. These rarely need to be shaped. Usually they're going to form a nice 4x4 dimension and then bush. Heavy pruning of these can cause a lot of damage to them. So you're just going to want to limit the pruning to remove any dead or damaged canes there. The knockout roses that I have on my property, the outermost canes are very, very healthy right now. But I need to prune out the center canes because those died and they shouldn't have been there in the first place. So I needed to pay a little more attention. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to remove those centermost canes that are dead and just make sure I trim anything dead off of the outside. If you have areas where there's excessive growth, like up the center, like I was just talking about, you're going to want to make sure to prune that out. Ideally, you're going to have kind of an empty center with these, so air movement and space is available for the plant to grow. All right, folks, that's all I have for you today. Like I said just a bit ago, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is in front of you right now. I've also included a link to our Purdue Ed Store, which has a lot of publications on roses and lots of other garden plants for you to take advantage of. And I have a link to our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. This lab is great for diagnosing problems. If you can't figure out what's going on, these people can help you figure that out. With that, I want to thank you all for watching, and please like and subscribe to our channel, and we will keep producing programs. Thank you very much.